In this last mini lecture on stem cuttings, we're going to go through the basic steps of taking a stem cutting. So the first thing you're going to do is take a very sharp knife or pruners and cut a piece at least 3 inches long from the plant. Now, a lot of times beginners will take cuttings that are too short or too long. You don't want it any shorter than 3 inches, and you don't want it any longer than 6 inches. There are a few plants that are exceptions to this rule, but for the most part, your cuttings should be 3 to 6 inches. Now, you want to use a sharp tool so you don't crush the plant tissue while you're cutting it. You're going to cut the bottom at an angle, just like you would some flowers before you put them in a vase. And if you can, you want to try to have a node at the base. It's not totally required, but it does help. So you can see the cutting in the picture here does have a node at the base of the cutting. If there are any flowers or fruits on your cutting, you want to remove those. There's 2 reasons for that. First, flowers and fruits generally rot in the high humidity environment that you're going to put your cutting in, which we want to prevent. And for some plants, they will actually put in energy to further develop those flowers or fruits, and we don't want our cutting to do that. We want it to put all its energy towards forming new roots. Finally, you're going to strip the lowest leaves from the cutting base. So you're going to take all the leaves off the bottom third to half of your cutting. The reason you do this is you don't want those leaves to touch the media. The media is wet, and so those leaves will rot, and again, we want as little rotting as possible in our cutting environment. Now, if you're propagating a plant with very large leaves, you may want to cut those leaves in half. As you can see in the picture here, they're cutting the leaf in half, and you're going to do it perpendicular to the midvein of that leaf. Now, there's a couple reasons to do that. The first is space requirements. Obviously, if you have really large leaves, you're going to be limited on how many cuttings you put in your cutting environment. And when you're using a pot with a bag or a soda bottle top over it, you don't have a lot of space. And you don't want your cuttings to be too crowded. The leaves should just be overlapping with each other. If it's more crowded than that, what happens is you have bad airflow and you end up getting a lot of fungal problems. So cutting those leaves in half makes the cuttings take up less space. It also reduces the transpiration area. Remember that on the underside of the leaves, you have those stomata, those pores, through which water is transpiring. So the plant is regularly losing water through those pores, through those stomata. If you cut the leaf in half, you've just gotten rid of half of the stomata. Now you're probably thinking, well, if cutting it in half gets rid of half the stomata, why don't I just pull all the leaves off and get rid of all of the stomata? Well, you want to keep some photosynthetic area available on the plant. A significant enough part of the plant to photosynthesize that you're going to get enough sugars to provide the plant with energy as that cutting is forming new roots. That said, this time of year, a lot of your plants are deciduous and they won't have leaves at all, and that's fine. They can still root in that condition. But if your plants already have leaves on them and you want to trim them, only trim them in half. Now, the whole transpiration thing is much more important for you as you propagate plants by cuttings at home. In the industry, stem cuttings are always under intermittent mist, or almost always, and so that mist keeps the leaves coated with water all the time, and it reduces transpiration enough that we don't have to worry about cutting leaves in half for that reason. But at home, if you don't have a mist system, it's going to be really important for your large-leaved plants. After that, you're going to apply rooting hormone. Now, you don't have to apply rooting hormone. Some plants, particularly a lot of house plants and even some woody plants such as willows, don't need rooting hormone to root, but most of the plants that you'll have access to do. Rooting hormone does several things. It helps increase the percentage of rooting, so you might get 5 to 8 cuttings out of 10 rooting instead of just 2. It also increases the number and quality of roots on your cuttings, so not only does it increase the percentage of cuttings that actually form roots, but it puts more roots on those cuttings that root and longer, more branched roots, better quality roots. Rooting hormone also helps the cuttings form a more uniform and consistent root system, so a nice symmetrical root system, which is what we want. And finally, it speeds up rooting. Stem cuttings, and really all cuttings, are all about a race between forming roots on that cutting before it dries out. So being able to speed up rooting is really great and important. So you don't have to use rooting hormone, but you're going to be much, much more successful if you do. And it's not hard to get a hold of. So rooting hormone, if you remember from your plant anatomy and physiology lecture a few weeks back, is auxin. Auxin is the hormone that induces root formation on cuttings. Now, auxin comes in different chemical forms. IAA, which stands for indole acetic acid. I'm not going to ask you to remember what the letters stand for, but you should remember IAA, IBA, etc. IAA is naturally found in plants, but it's not usually used by the nursery industry because it's a very unstable compound. The forms of auxin typically used commercially are IBA, which stands for indole butyric acid, and sometimes NAA, which stands for naphthalene acetic acid. IBA and NAA are both used pretty widely commercially. They're synthetic auxins, although IBA is found naturally in plants too, just in very small concentrations. Now, what you'll usually find in the store is IBA, like at Lowe's or at garden centers. Sometimes it's a mix between IBA and NAA. IBA is by far the most common. And when you go to buy rooting hormone, there's two main forms you'll find. One is a talc powder form, and that's what's shown in the picture here. This includes brands like Take Root, Rootone, and Hormidin. These talc powder auxins are particularly good for herbaceous stem cuttings. However, they're not very strong, they're not very concentrated, and so if you can get a hold of it, the liquid auxin is actually better for woody stem cuttings, although powder is better than nothing. So some brand names of liquid rooting hormone are Dip and Grow. Simone K Plus is one that's produced locally here in North Carolina. The guy that invented it runs a place in Smithfield called Coors Farm Supply. And if you look them up online and you give him a call, tell him you're in this class, tell him why you need it, he'll probably ship it to you. You can also go there, which is quite the experience. Woods Rooting Compound, this is just another brand of liquid rooting hormone. Now, one thing to be aware of when you're out there looking to buy rooting hormone, make sure that it lists IBA or NAA as an active ingredient somewhere on the bottle. If it doesn't, it is not rooting hormone. I don't care what they call it. It is a fertilizer. An example of this is something called Olivia's Cloning Gel. There are gel form rooting hormones, but that's not one of them. If you look at the ingredients, all it has is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. It is a fertilizer. It is not rooting hormone. So make sure whatever brand you buy doesn't matter, but make sure that it has IBA or NAA listed as an active ingredient on it. Finally, one more tip about applying rooting hormone. You'll see it says extra wounding there at the bottom of the slide. Particularly in the winter when you're doing hardwood cuttings, putting a little extra wound on the base of your cutting can help it absorb the rooting hormone better. And so the way you can do this is to take a razor blade or a sharp knife and just scrape some of the bark off on either side of the stem, or make a little slit on either side of the stem. You don't want to really make a very strong deep cut, but just enough to scratch through the bark, and you want to make sure to do it on either side of the stem, or on, if you're just doing a little slice, on four sides of the stem, so that you get a uniform symmetrical root system. But extra wounding is something, particularly with hardwood cuttings, that can help your cutting root better. And then finally, you will stick your cutting in the media. This isn't the best picture in the world, but it's the one I could find. You're going to stick your stem cutting after you've treated it with rooting hormone into the media with one node in contact with or just below the substrate or the media surface. All right, so you want to stick your cutting into the media deep enough that it's not going to fall over, but you don't want to just bury it. In this picture, that cutting's a little bit deeper than I'd put it. And you can't see the node because this is a plant that doesn't have nodes, but the node would be right about here. So with that, all that is left is for you to give it a try. I put this picture in here. Another class I used to teach, we did tree climbing, and we didn't grade the students on how well they did with the tree climbing. We just urged them to give it a try. It's more difficult for some people than others. So you can see here's one of our favorite students giving it a try. He was a big old tall guy. When you're really tall, tree climbing becomes more of a challenge for you, just mechanically speaking. So with your cuttings, you're not going to be graded on the success of your cuttings. You're going to be graded on if you took them the way you were supposed to, if you followed directions, and if you record what happens to them during this semester accurately. So with that, I leave it to you to go take your cuttings. Enjoy!